Live.
Yes.
Okay, I think we're in and live on YouTube. Dear colleagues and friends, ladies and gentlemen in the whole world listening to this webinar number 2, welcome, warm welcome, depends on where you are. It could be evening, morning, afternoon, deep in the night. We're glad that you're there and trying to understand what we'll be talking about. I am activating my own live streaming. That's perfect. Good. So, second webinar, second ICORR webinar. This is the International Consortium of Rehabilitation Robotics talking. My name is Claudio. I'll introduce for 1 minute our great moderators. And then I will disappear since I am going to have a part as a speaker as well, so it seems. So Professor Denny Utomo, live from Melbourne, Indonesia, I guess. Professor at the University of Melbourne, previously at INRIA, Sophie Antipoli, south of France, and gotten his PhD at the National University of Singapore. Active member of the ICORR board and consortium, organizer, actually chair of the previous Rehab Week in Singapore. We all remember that in September 2023. And an associate editor of the Transactional Neural System, which possibly is our flagship journal, I would say. By the way, I'm an AE as well, and we have our editor-in-chief, Helen, as well, Professor Helen Huang. So the journal is very well represented. So Denny's research focuses on physical human-robot interaction and robot-assisted therapy for movement impairment, and also especially assistive wearable robots, including prosthetics and human intention estimation. A highlight of his research is the EMU robot that has been tech transferred to a very large, well-known company called Fourier Intelligence. I think this could be it. Denny, without much further ado, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, Claudio. Good morning, afternoon, and evening to everyone joining us for the webinar today. Welcome to the second installment of the ICORR Webinar Series 2024. Tonight, we'll be learning about the cutting edge of research, development, and translation of effective interfacing and control of neuroprostheses from 3 of the leading experts in this topic, who are in the order of speaking, Professor Max Ortiz Catalan of the Bionic Institute in Melbourne, Australia, who also holds a second affiliation with the University of Melbourne, Professor Helen Huang, who holds a joint appointment at the North Carolina State University and the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and Professor Claudio Castellini of the, I'm going to have to attempt this, Claudio, Friedrich Alexander University, or FAU, Erlangen, Nuremberg, Germany. I'm sorry, that was a difficult one for my tongue. And as introduced, I will serve as one of the moderators today, and I'm joined by Dr. Ekaterina Ivanova. As a quick introduction, Dr. Ivanova is currently a lecturer at Queen Mary University of London, with a second affiliation with the Human Robotics Group at the Imperial College London. Her research interests include multimodal human-robot interaction and haptic communication between agents. Now, for the webinar today, we'll have 3 speakers deliver their seminar for 15 minutes each, and I ask that you keep all the questions to the end of the talks, all the 3 talks, in the interest of keeping to time. To ask a question at any point in time, please enter your question in the YouTube chat. Dr. Ivanova and I will collate them and ask the speakers in the Q&A time. And please feel free to include your name if you are comfortable, so we can address you when the speakers answer your question. Now, without further ado, we'll get on with the business of the day. I will pass this over to Dr. Ivanova to introduce our first speaker. Katya, over to you.
Hello everyone, also from my side. Thank you, Danny, for introduction. And now I will introduce Max. So yeah, it's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Professor Max Ortiz Catalan, who is the head of neuroprosthetic research at the Bionics Institute in Melbourne, in Australia, who is also honorary principal fellow at the University of Melbourne, also in Australia. He is also affiliate professor at the Biorobotics Institute, Scuola Superiore Sant'Anna, Italy, and board member of the Prometei Pain Rehabilitation Center in Ukraine. Professor Ortiz Catalan has created several biomedical innovations, including the first robotic limb connected to the user's skeleton, nerves, and muscles, and novel treatments for neuropathic pain due to sensory motor impairments, such as phantom limb pain. He has authored over 100 scientific papers in very prestigious scientific journals. He has been keynote in the most important conferences in his field and also received several honors and awards. So we welcome Professor Ortiz Catalan and are thrilled to discover more about his current research.
Thank you, Katya. That's kind. I will share my screen now. Great. So I hope you can see my screen. And yeah, so I'm going to be talking about the work we've been doing on bionic limbs. And basically, if you break down the challenge of replacing a biological arm or leg with an artificial one, is mostly fourfold. Is the prosthetic hardware, that's what you see in the daily life, so to say, is the gears, the motors, the frame, all the mechatronic part. Then you have a way to control it, and this needs to be rather reliable for patients to use it. I always like to mention that these are not toys. Prosthetic limbs are devices that need to be reliable and need to respond to the patient's intent to be useful in their daily lives. And once you have control, and if you want to extend that control, you need to have some sort of sensory feedback. And all of this, it doesn't make much sense, or is not very useful if you don't have a way to attach it to the body. And actually, the attachment of the prosthesis to the body is one of the major sources of problems for people with amputation. And then you can argue if there's hierarchy of needs when it comes to all these different aspects. I will say there is. I mean, you need to be able to control a device for sensory feedback to make sense. There's not many examples in nature where sensory feedback is alone without the possibility to do something about it. And then, of course, if you can wear the prosthesis, again, it's not very useful. So we can debate that a little bit later. But if we look at the state of the art when it comes to prosthetic devices, there's several commercially available hands that are individually they have individual fingers that can be controlled or multi-articulated, several degrees of freedom. And you can buy this off the shelf. That has increased quite a bit in the past years. And the challenge has remained how we control it. And controlling the prosthesis comes down to extracting neural information to have an intuitive control of the prosthesis, and how we make sense of that information. And to do that, you have to decide where you're going to connect to the biological system, the brain, the nerves, or the muscles. We tend to favor the muscles because it's much easier. And then, depending on where you're connecting, you can also do it in different ways. You can have different sensors. The most common one is electrodes, but you can also implant magnets or use force sensors. Optogenetics, for instance, it's been discussed lately. And based on what sensors you have algorithms and electronics to make sense of your whole system. So there's a lot of work's been done on doing what's called myoelectric pattern recognition, that is looking at the activity of the residual limb with several sensors and decoding that information in different ways. So machine learning has been one of the preferred ones, but you can also use other methods. And this has been going on for several decades. My group has done work on this for a few years, but there are commercially available systems that can do this, initially by the co-op system in 2012, and now some of the major companies have their own system. And this is mostly using surface electrodes, and then you can only extract so much information for the surface of the skin, and also you tend to have reliability problems when you have the skin electrode interface. So to solve this problem, then we can look at the electronics, we can look at algorithms. We decided to take a look at the electrodes or the sensors. And then we realized that for many years, or you can say a few decades, we know that if you implant an electrode, you obtain much more reliable signals, and you can target deeper muscles. And an advantage of going implanted is that you can also connect to the severed nerves and deliver sensory feedback. So we know that if we connect to a nerve, it doesn't matter along the axis where you put it, and you stimulate the afferent fibers, the brain will create experience of sensations as arising from whatever that fiber used to be connected. So if there's an afferent that used to be connected to mechanoreceptors in my thumb, and I stimulate it in my forearm or my arm, my brain will create experience of touch coming from my thumb. So that's very useful for prosthetics, because the space that's occupied by that phantom is now occupied by a prosthetic limb. So when we stimulate the nerves, the patients have sensations arising from, or perceived to be arising from their prosthesis. Well, we know this works since the 70s, right? And it's been done in upper limbs, and it's been done in lower limbs. The challenge has been that if you go implanted and your prosthesis is not implanted, you have to have a certain communication in between these two, and then you have the skin in between. And this is a lot of information that needs to be transferred. There are certain requirements for this interface. It has to be safe, because you don't want to be doing surgeries all the time, and stable, same reason. And the main challenge is the bandwidth. So we have had wireless interfaces with implanted neurostimulators or pacemakers for a few years now. Those are programmed from time to time. So a single shot, you can wait a few minutes, that's fine. In a prosthetic device, it needs to be transferring information continuously for sensory feedback or for control. So that is kind of the challenge with the wireless interfaces. There are different ways in which this can be done. The standard way will be to have a centralized system. All your electronics are in a single case, and then you have leads to your targets. Lately has been development on decentralized systems. Yet this have not been reported in daily use on patients, although I believe there is an experiment going on in Case Western using implanted electrodes for sensory feedback. And this has been done, the IME systems, for instance, for control in upper and lower limbs in a couple of patients. Excuse me. So the way we went about these problems is wired using an osseous-integrated implant. And the reason why we selected that interface is because this also helped us to solve the fourth problem, which is the attachment of the prosthesis. So the standard way you connect a prosthesis to the body is with a socket. The socket puts a lot of pressure on the residual limb, and that creates several problems because there's friction every time you move. It can also block the adjacent joints that are otherwise healthy. So in these patients, for instance, has a full range of motion on the shoulder, but because of the technology of attachment, that limits the mobility and the usability of that joint. And as you can see there are marks of where the socket is, so it's quite uncomfortable. So instead of that, you can use a titanium implant for skeletal attachment, and this is known as osseointegration. It's a phenomenon that occurs when you put titanium inside bones. Bones are grow tightly around the implant, and then it becomes mechanically stable. And this technology is being used clinically for more than 20 years. And when I joined the field, I took these technologies as a base and then re-engineered to also allow communication with implanted neural interfaces, electrodes in nerves and muscles. And in this way, we address the other three problems in the field: the control, the sensory feedback, and the mechanical attachment.
So I can work with almost everything. It's not feeling like a machine. It's more like my own art. I realize I don't feel handicapped.
I'm not sure if you were able to hear that. I don't recall if I shared with sound, but the patient is basically saying that he's using the prosthesis in his daily life, and he doesn't feel a handicap. And we have to remember that this is The first implementation, it was done in January 2013, is 1 degree of freedom with also sensor feedback, which came a couple of years later, because first we have an analog. So the first system that I designed for the patient to wear was entirely analog. The control was, I will argue, still a bit better because analog electronics tend to be more reliable than the digital ones. But we can, if you want to do neurostimulation and you have to move to more sophisticated decoding and control algorithms, you have to go digital. And with Enzo Massino, my first PhD student, we developed this embedded system that allows to run these algorithms that I described before, but also deliver electrical pulses to produce sensory feedback. So this is one of the first demos we did with the patient. So he's controlling the hand by the implanted electrodes, and then there's a sensor in the thumb. So when the sensor detects the contact with the grate, we started stimulating the patient. Know there's an object in the hand, and then it stops contracting. So now he knows there's an object, and then it won't crush it. So here we tell the patient, okay, close the hand. When you feel there's an object on the hand, stop and let us know. And that's what he does there. So now he's receiving a stimulation. He knows that the egg is on the hand. And then at the end, of course, we blindfold him and put noise canceling or occluded the hearing so he wouldn't hear the motors. And at the end, we just asked him to crash the egg to show that it was a real one and not a prop for the demo. So this being, of course, a collaboration between engineers and medical professionals, surgeons, particularly Dr. Rika Bronnemar, who's been working on osseointegration for mostly all his career, and then Dr. Paolo Sasso, who joined us in this project. So that's all very well, but as I described, that was 1 degree of freedom, 1 sensation, and then we look at, okay, how can we increase this? We look at the source, and what you can do here is surgical reconstruction. There is a surgical procedure called targeted muscle reinnervation, in which you transfer a severed nerve into available muscles that have no biomechanical function because there's no joints anymore to be actuated, but we can use as biological amplifiers. And by doing that, you can get more signals for control. So we reported the use of this system in daily life for 3 years at a time when that paper came out. And there should be a movie playing here, which is not playing, but the patient is basically using it on his daily life. And as you can see, these patients have a relatively active jobs. And one of the advantages with this system is that with surface electrodes, it tends to be problematic in cold environments, which is an issue in Sweden where I used to be. So the skin gets dry, the contact doesn't, the electrode doesn't pick up the signals anymore. But when you have them implanted, it works equally well at -20 or +30 degrees. And we can, of course, evaluate in function the improvement on function objectively with functional outcomes, but we also were interested in what were the social, psychological consequences of having this implant permanently attached to the body. And we partnered with a medical anthropologist, Alexander Middleton from Princeton University, and we wrote this paper. She's hopefully soon will publish an ethnography on these patients. And what we found is that the patients feel much better with themselves. They engage in more activities and also a wider range of activities. And this is, again, with a couple of degrees of freedoms, 1 sensation that doesn't represent all the function of a hand. So trying to see how we can increase the function, we look back again at the source, and we have this idea that instead of just transferring the whole nerve into available muscle, split the different fascicles and then use one to target an available muscle, that will be TMR, and then have a free muscle graft transfer from the leg, for instance, to use as biological amplifiers for the other fascicles, which is normally known as regenerative peripheral nerve interfaces. So what we show in this article is that if you split the fascicles of the nerve, you can concurrently innervate native muscles and free muscles grafts. And then if you take all this information together, you can improve your decoding. So let me see, where is my mouse? Oh, this is annoying. So I just tested that video before we started. So what you will have seen there is the patient controlling the hand elbow, the wrist, and the effector. These videos are online. You can find them there, and he's controlling them intuitively, basically thinking about flexing the elbow, rotating the wrist and the hand. And then what we could achieve with this technology, which unfortunately you won't be able to see because that video is not playing either. Again, this is online, so I'll happy to share some of the links later to put on the webinar. So this patient is controlling every finger of the hand. So he thinks about flexing the thumb flexes the index finger, the middle finger, and so on. Flexion and extension of every finger. And I'll argue that this is the only patient in the world with a transhumeral amputation today that can control every finger intuitively of the hand. And this is only possible because, or it's possible because we did surgical reconstruction of the residual limb, and then we incorporated machine learning to make sense of all that activity. Because of course, when you split the fascicles and you put these free muscle grafts, it's not like you have one for the thumb, one for the index finger. They contract at different measures depending what movement is done, and therefore pattern recognition is important to be able to decode the full intention. So we've done this for the below elbow amputations as well. The challenge here is that you have smaller bones, so you have to re-engineer a little bit more that implant. And there is definitely something going on with this presentation now. Anyway, so what you will see here is the patient controlling the hand with implanted electrodes, and we stimulate as well, so she will be sensing how soft those several objects are and sorting them accordingly. And here again, the idea is to have a skeletal attachment using osseointegration, implanted electrodes for control, and in muscles and electrodes in the nerves to provide sensory feedback. And again, this has been a collaboration with surgeons, plastic and orthopedics, and a group of engineers. And surgical reconstruction is thought to play a major role, I would say, in bionics. It's instead of breaking our heads designing neural interfaces that can give us access to all the neural information for control that we need, we can facilitate the job of the engineers creating these interfaces by doing some surgical reconstruction, and then we can have more channels of ways to access that information. We're actually running a large international clinical trial on these surgical procedures, particularly for pain, but this is also one effort to help. We have standardized these procedures. These papers are coming up now, and try to disseminate them around the world. We work with the sensory feedback. We try to stimulate in different ways. There's only so many things you can do with pulses. And what we've seen is that, of course, you can, depending on the waveforms you use, you will stimulate different fibers, and that will create different percepts. And then the question is, how can we use these percepts to make the prosthesis more functional? And something that is good about our system is that since we have a system that the patients are using at home, when we do research and we find algorithms that are more useful for stimulation or control, we can upgrade the prosthesis of the patients, and they can leave home with a better system than what they arrive. So a lot of probably the major contribution of our work has been on this translational part. Our patients have participated on the Cybathlon. In this group, probably you're familiar with that. If you're not, you can Google it. It's a very interesting competition. We had a paper publishing some of those results. There's been a lot of documentaries done on our work, so you can find that online. And that's about me. So you can find us in social media. My original group was called the Biomechatronics and Neurorehabilitation Lab, that developed into a center that I created. It was called the Center for Bionics and Pain Research. And now that I moved to Australia, I'm evolving that into a new center that's called the Neurobionics. So you can follow the progress of that work on that way. So I'll stop here, and then I think I'll take questions at the end.
Thank you, Max. That's only 15 minutes and you've packed so much into it. It's always impressive. No matter how many times I listen to it, it's always very inspiring. Yeah. Thank you very much. So I will now move on to the next speaker. It is my pleasure to introduce our second speaker for this webinar. Professor Helen Huang is the Jackson Family Distinguished Professor in the Joint Department of Biomedical Engineering at North Carolina State University and the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She is the Director of the Closed Loop Engineering for Advanced Rehabilitation Core and a Fellow of AI MBE, Fellow of IEEE, NC State Faculty Scholar, and she is the Editor-in-Chief for IEEE TNSRE, Transactions on Neurosystems and Rehabilitation Engineering. Please join me in welcoming Professor Helen Huang.
Thank you, Danny. Let me share my slides. 1 second. Okay. Can you all see? Okay, awesome. All right. So
yes.
Thank you for the introduction and inviting me to give a talk. I lead a lab called the Neuromuscular Rehabilitation Engineering Lab. So my research mainly focus on these wearable robots and then come with the science and the technology to merge human and the wearable robots together to improve overall the quality of life for individual who has physical disabilities. So just a kind of like area that I'm covering in the lab. I do a research related to neural-machine interface for prosthetics. So this is my main focus for this talk. And then I also work on artificial intelligence for making the wearable robots more smart, being able to coordinate with the human seamlessly. And the lab also investigate human-robot interaction and also co-adaptation with the aim to develop a better wearable device as well as a human adaptation approach, allow the two partners to work together. So in this talk, I would like to actually just introduce several decoding algorithms for decoding the neural signal from the residual muscle from individual has a limb amputation, and then also using that to understand the human's intent and then control the device. So it's a neural control. So in this talk, I thought it's more general. I just want to introduce a couple of existing concepts, and hopefully this would helpful for especially students in the audience to learn and then also to think further what is the next approach. Okay, so starting with concept, I coined a lot of terms. But black box is a typical way we talk about machine learning. So machine learning is widely used for decoding neural signal, no matter it's a pattern recognition or kind of a more filter regression approach to predict the continuous information. So the idea is you taking the signal from the residual muscle, and then you try while the person is imagine actually attempt to moving the residual limb, and then you can decode actually what the person is wanted to do, and then you can use that information to control. So this approach not only widely used for upper limb, I also migrated this, being a long time ago when I was a postdoc working on this for decoding the EMG for lower limb. So this is one example using the pattern recognition. So you would be able to decode what the intent of the user to predict what the next step, what is the type of local motion mode, such as level ground walking, was there ascent or descent, what type of local motion mode the person would plan to do for the next step. Then you can control the lower level controller for the robotic prosthetic leg to change the control mode and then allow the person to transit different terrain seamlessly. So this is, again, this is early on my research that is demonstrating the algorithm would work for people with just using this neural supervisory control, being able to allow the amputee walk with a robotic device to transit the terrains seamlessly without, changing, manually changing the control mode. Okay, so I didn't talk too much detail because I think in the field that there's a lot of research still going on, using this data-driven machine learning-based approach. So the advantage I can see is usually training these algorithm is pretty quick, and then also it's quite flexible, especially like pattern recognition or neural network, that as long as you provide enough information from the residual muscle, then you would be able to decode without much problem. So like the crosstalk across the EMG channels won't be a huge challenge. So it's more flexible for the EMG electrode placement. This is more important for amputee, as identify an individual muscle might be challenging. But this advantage, of course, this learning transfer or is the challenge part for robust performance of this machine learning approach. Like just, for example, if there's a new situation where new data pattern comes in, can machine capture that? And then also these black box mapping inside of the black box, the mapping mechanism is not completely known, right? So there's no physical meaning related to that. So after I work on this approach for a while, so I was thinking further about this mechanism, because in terms of like this neurophysiology about how human using the nerve to control the musculoskeletal system. So the entire procedure is known, right? So we know the EMG would be activate muscle to cause a muscle contraction that will generate a force, and the force will pull around the joint to generate the torque. Then the limb is gonna move. So this whole procedure has been well described in the field. So then it comes with my second concept I call a white box, or maybe a transparent box, so that you can actually changing this the mapping that doesn't really means anything become follow the physiological concept. So the idea in this case will be we just build this virtual neural-driven muscular skeletal model, right? So then the EMG comes in that will activate the muscle, and the muscle can be modeled with, for example, Hill's model, and then generate a force, and then act around the joint, generate the torque become, right, adding the force become a motion. So in this approach, although this is, I call it transparent, it means that the mapping from EMG to the external motion is basically well structured. So the parameters inside has a certain physiological meaning. However, to figure out these parameters, you still need has a procedure to training and then find out what is the parameters inside of this well-structured mapping. So the procedure we're doing this is we let the person, we record the residual muscle. I don't know if you can see my mouse. So you can record the residual muscles activity while the person doing a mirror kind of a motion from the both side. And then we're using the motion from the some side as kind of a ground truth. What is the intent of the user actually performing? So then during we use the optimization approach iteratively in order to figure out what's the parameter. So again, we have the EMG, right, driven this musculoskeletal model decoder to estimate the position. So then this is compared with the ground truth, and then we're trying to optimize and minimize this error. If the error is too big, we will come back and then update the parameter iteratively until this mapping is become more close or perfect, reduce the error between the estimate and the measured motion. Okay, and then the one thing that I felt like when I work on this is because this musculoskeletal model across human, they are in terms of like the muscle that specific muscles act on each individual joint is similar with, across the human. So perhaps we could also build up this generic model. So the idea is, so people using a different way to build a generic model, like, study a cadaver, limb, or in this case, we actually optimizing multiple users' data and then doing the average and then we plug in this average value as the generic model. And then the interesting aspect is it worked pretty well. So without even running recalibrate or rerun this optimization for each individual. So generic model, you hook up with a new patient, a new person, that they would be able to perform the task pretty well. For amputee, as long as they still have this residual muscle, we can identify it, and then we can capture those muscle. Then this generic model could also work. So this part is making me thinking that, using the model approach, if the residual muscles activity is still there, that could make it more generalizable. So so this is the same concept could also use for lower limb. So the idea, we have actually migrated this idea into the lower limb EMG control prosthetic ankle. In this case, the muscular skeletal model we build is basically just in the lower limb. And this is just demonstrating that our preliminary testing of this model-based control of prosthetic ankle using the neural EMG to drive. And we have demonstrating that this approach allow the person to generate a much better posture stability, more posture control capability. Okay, so this white box approach to me is, the generalizability is wonderful when they see a new kind of data, because it's already well structured. So even the new data comes in, it produces a pretty good estimation of the joint torque and also the motion. The other one is beyond getting the motion out, you actually can go back into the system, because those is inside of the mapping system. It has a specific physiological meaning, such as you can get actually muscle force or joint torque out of this mapping approach. Of course, the problem is you have to have a specific muscle recording. So you have to target a specific muscle. If there's too much crosstalk, this approach won't work. And also it requires, if running this optimization for each individual, it takes a long time. It's like hours. My students sometimes take days to finish the optimization. Okay. So therefore, I talk about the black and the white. So I came with coined the third term. Perhaps we can leverage these both together as a gray box. So add them together. So quickly, we are actually using one of the approaches. So we actually come up with a multiple approach that you can combine the machine learning and the known physiology together. So I'm just showing one example that we have recently published is this is still follow the physiological procedure for motion production. So the EMG will mapping into the joint force and then joint torque. And the torque will drive this physiological forward dynamic model and predict the motion. Okay, so this green box is just the pipeline, right? So how our muscle activation became actually motion of the limb. But the question is, the difference is we actually use a neural network to estimate the joint torque rather than using the muscle model. The question is how we train this neural network. Of course, people can use the inverse dynamic, but usually during the calibration or data training approach, we might be able to get the motion quickly, but getting a torque is hard. So the idea is we actually using this new training mechanism is through the reinforcement learning framework. So the idea is, again, during using training data, we use the reinforcement learning trying to training the neural network, and the entire pipeline allowed the reward, which is the arrow between, so let's say the cost is the arrow between the estimate joint motion and then actually measure the joint motion to be minimized. So this is still an optimization technique. So without too much detail, if you're interested, you can read some of our work. We did in the paper, we did compare other like model-based or black box based approach. Without showing too much detail, I want to show you the performance. So this approach is performed pretty well, especially the motion is quite coordinated and smooth. And then also we have a demonstrating through an offline analysis that this algorithm is more robust and generalizable compared to this data-driven approach. Compared to the musculoskeletal model, again, the flexibility for place the EMG electrodes is actually a plus, especially this would be super useful for testing this on amputee. Okay, so again, I'm just demonstrating that this approach, the benefit of this is it still can, so it's maintain the benefit of kind of both, and especially it can obtain this meaningful internal state, such as a joint torque. And I always think that joint torque would be useful, especially for lower limb, right? So then your controller would be much easy to structure. But for upper limb, the joint torque is also useful. So current work quickly is we actually using this joint torque to smooth this transition between the autonomous control for grasping and also the EMG control. The challenging part is when you grasp an object, you really have to estimate what is the friction of that object or weight. People has using all kind of like a computer vision approach or other like kind of a touching approach. So we actually leave this to human. So human would see like say egg shell, then they would be able to just generate so we want to start with like a large force. So using the human estimated through the EMG estimated the grasping initial contact, the grasping force would be helpful for this shared control to be transited seamlessly. So this is just a quick demonstration of okay. So yeah, so this is demonstrating we use the EMG to decoding the motion and the initial force. And we use some sensor, the pressure sensor and also optical sensor to generate slip prevention, also automatic grasping. And then the user would be able to, grasping eggshell, which is a very delicate objects without a break it. We could also, estimate like a heavy box and then being able to grasp. And then the grasping part is autonomous control, so without a human. Okay, so I think that's all for my talk. Thank you, and happy to answer question after the talk.
Thank you very much, Helen. Amazing talk, really inspiring. And we now move to our final speaker of the day is Professor Claudio Castellini, who is a researcher in medical robotics, focusing on rehabilitation and assistive robotics, human-machine interaction and human-machine interfaces, and applied machine learning. Professor Castellini obtained his degree in electronic engineering from University of Genoa, Italy, his PhD in artificial intelligence from the School of Informatics of the University of Edinburgh, Scotland. He then focused on assistive robotics during his postdoc time at the Advanced Robotics Laboratory of the University of Genoa. And in 2009, he joined Institute of Robotics and Mechatronics at the DLR, German Aerospace Agency, as a senior researcher. And in 2021, he has been appointed full professor of assistive intelligent robotics at the Friedrich Alexander University of Erlangen-Nuremberg, Germany. I hope I pronounced it better than Danny.
That's one of the assignments we get at the beginning. So you
exactly. I learned my German for 10 years just for this moment. So Professor Claudio Castellini published more than 150 scientific papers. He is involved in several research projects, and he is also serving in a number of international editorial boards and committees. And I'm very excited to hear his talk. And yeah, so welcome, Professor Castellini.
Thank you. So as I am, from the point of view of the age, the most senior, the oldest, let's face it, the oldest speaker here, this talk is going to be a little more abstract, possibly, than what my estimated colleagues did before. And it's going to be wordy and boring to some extent, but I have a couple movies that will possibly refresh the situation. So I'm going to concentrate on data quality and time in prosthetic control. So, and just to set the stage straight since the beginning, data quality is, I don't have a precise definition of data quality. So it's a talk about something I don't know about, but sometimes possibly for the youngsters, for the young people who are watching this webinar, this could be inspiring. I hope it can inspire some thoughts. So more food for thoughts than real actual results. So I have a premise. So co-adaptation is a keyword that I heard mentioned by both our other speakers, and it's been circulating in the community for a while. And there's also these fancy words like coming from the world of psychology, what agency and embodiment. Whereas intent detection is what I have been focusing upon for about 15 years now. So just as a premise and to throw in a few keywords, how do these three things interact? So as far as I understand, and this is my limited knowledge as an engineer, agency is, am I using this device really? Am I using it? Embodiment is, do I feel this device is an extension to my own body? And then we have, like already highlighted by Max and Helen, intent detection, which is one way of exchanging information from the user to the machine, and feedback is the other way around. So the machine feels something in a very specific way, so there's sensors sending back things to the user. Now, I have a few questions here, and I don't yet have answers to them. So intent detection and feedback, do they lead to optimal control of the device? Because that's what we're all looking for, right? So, and it goes beyond prosthetics. So it's not just prosthetics. There's someone who has lost some of their motor functions, and what they have is some muscle residual activity, or neuromuscular, however you want to call it, residual activity. We want to use that activity, somehow interpret it, to have these people control devices that will help them either rehabilitate, so regain lost functions, say take a spinal cord patient, or literally control devices that will become companions for their life, hopefully, if they get accepted. And this would be amputated persons. Now, about agency and embodiment, does optimal control entail agency and embodiment, or are agency and embodiment things that we should foster and use as further measures of acceptance and performance? And remember, they are not so easy to measure. So there are ways, sort of accepted ways in the psychological community to measure agency and embodiment, but mostly it's questionnaires with all the, the non-determinism, say, that implies. But then anyway, my working hypothesis is that yes, optimal control would lead to embodiment and agency. So that's why we focus on intent detection, because intent detection is so reliable and dexterous. Natural intent detection, to my opinion, is the key to gain optimal control of these devices. So intent detection is, like I said, I'm not going to spend so much on this. In my 2 sentences that I sell to my students here, guessing what a user wants to do and then controlling a robot according to this guess, right? And there's, so far this is any device which interacts with a person. Say you control your smartphone by moving your fingers on the surface of the touch screen. Now, additional constraints is that in our case, users have lost some of their motor functionalities because they cannot properly move, or they have lost a limb, or they were born without a limb. That's also a very quite frequent and very interesting case. And so intent detection is the detection of muscle activation. And now I'm throwing in a controversial statement, machine learning. That's what we use, right, for doing intent detection. And the assumption is machine learning is, but first of all, it has achieved a number of successes. It's wonderful, it's everywhere. So they call it artificial intelligence. We in the field prefer to say machine learning, but that's the core of AI as we know it today. And nowadays AI is everywhere because it's become commercially viable. So it does wonderful things. And so what we do is we take the signals that our users produce while trying to do something, and then we're trying to use machine learning to discern what the users are doing. And sometimes we have to have these detections overlap or mix up so that the prediction is smooth. Now, my experience is that the whole problem is not about machine learning, really. It's more about data quality and about time and interaction. First of all, why machine learning is probably not exactly the key. Well, machine learning this is a paper I published on a psychology review magazine, actually journal a few years ago. I'm really proud of this because, it's very seldom the case that engineers can publish really on psychology journals or something else, something really out of your field. Now here we started out with a few paragraphs which are basically lay science, right? So popular science. What is machine learning? It's still programming. But then machine learning has the ability to match things. So I see something new and that recalls something that I saw in the past. And it all, the problem is all in how can I say, tuning the parameters of the machine learning method. So how exactly you do that, that's not exactly known in the beginning. It depends on the data. Let me show you, and this is something I always tell my students as well. This is for the youngsters. This is something which did not work. So this is a negative result. In 2014, this is back in the days, myself with no gray hair, but still with glasses that I gave up right now. So I'm using a tactile bracelet, so high density force myography that had been manufactured for us by Risto Koiva and crew at the Center for Interaction Technology at Bielefeld in Germany. And as you can see, we had an almost perfect control. Well, I had an almost perfect control on a virtual hand. And notice that I'm using 3 degrees of freedom as the mechanical engineers and the engineers say. I prefer to say that there are 7 actions involved because the degree of freedom is a very robotic concept. When I speak about human limbs, I prefer to say actions. So an action is closing the hand, an action is flexing the wrist, another action is extending the wrist. So there's 2 different things. As you can see, the speed was, well, there was some delay, of course, but then the speed was remarkably high, meaning that this was linear regression. There's no big deal there. And the data we collected was possibly less than a couple of minutes. And as you can see, I was able to, mix and match the actions. So, smoothly combine closing, flexion, and extension. And then this approach did not really work. So it was beautiful on the bench of my lab and by myself, and I was the best user in the world, of course. Then he did an experiment on a few people, involving them in such an experiment, and the success rate was really unremarkable. I guess about 50%, I think I remember. So that's something that my now Dr. Mathilde Conon, my PhD student at that time, sweated bullets about, and the results were, even as remarked by the reviewers of this paper, unfortunately, not really. You see, I'm smiling there, but then it didn't really work. Why didn't it work? That's where I started my journey. I believe, machine learning was working, but the point is, first of all, you're in controlled conditions, so you're just in your lab. And second, you're the best user possible. So when you see putting more emphasis on the human being, the user was missing from the picture, really. The idea is that I want to, exploit, in double quotes, of course, involve the user to get better data and get a better sensors. So those sensors were as well, there were a couple technological flaws, but there's so much more that we can do nowadays. And so improving on sensors and improving on the interaction with the patient. So involving the user in the dialogue with the machine, give me better data, I want more data, and then incorporating new data and forgetting about past data on demand. Now, what does that practically mean? So improving on the interaction means, let's neglect the sensors for this talk, which is, the time is too short here. But what do I mean improve on interaction? It means that literally the machine should stand up and say, hey, I need more data here because you're doing something and I don't exactly know what that is. And especially my big point is time is the key. If you let users learn how to use an object, say you buy a new motorbike, you really become proficient. You can become a decent, I did it myself when I was 25, become a decent motorbike rider in the turn of 1 month, possibly. Now, the bike will not adapt so much to you, but these machines can, because we can have machines which will adapt in the course of time to the new signals. It's very well known that signals that we gather from users change, because people learn how to produce the better signals to control the devices. And now the device must follow suit. They must adapt to the signals the patient produces, and then involve the patient in a sort of virtuous loop. And this would be co-adaptation, in my opinion. So this is an experiment that we carried out a few years ago. Again, Mathilde was involved in it, but as well Marek, my current PhD student, and Maximo Roa, and a number of other wonderful colleagues at DLR. So we were teleoperating the Toro platform, and we were involving people in trying and doing these very, 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 very complex bimanual coordination actions. And the devices we're using were minimal, I would say. So there's a few IMUs on the torso and on the arms for position control. And then we were using 2 Mayos. So the Mayo is this, we all know this little bracelet, which is now unfortunately out of production. It's 8 SEMG sensors of non-clinical quality. So it was basically a game controller. And to our amazement, this was just a demonstration, but to our amazement, this became an interesting experiment because people were really in the turn of half an hour learning how to do this. And there was now and then updating involved. So Donato, a former student, used to say, okay, the hand is not closing properly. So the system would stop, we would gather new data, update the model, and then the grasping would become completely stable in all situations required by this experiment. That must be underlined, right? And so we made the experiment as complex as we could so that we could say, well, at least in this case, it works for a lot of different possibilities. Now, we then involved a person who was born without his right hand, Wolfgang, one of our testimonials. Now, he was able to complete the same tasks in, I think it was 2 sigma of the, so 2 sigma within the time allotted to complete the tasks. So by that time, we were sort of claiming, doesn't really matter if you have no hand, you can still use, so in this case, you would use just the Mayo, the EMG signals to open and close the hand, and there's 3 actions you can perform, so pointing, the index, and then resting. So it was a simple task, but they learned how to do it in all possible positions. And even more remarkable, we were able to involve one of the very seldom, very, very rare, luckily, double-sided transradial amputated persons. And he was able as well, with no knowledge of what he was doing, to control the robot. Took him some time more. Now, what is this? Is it a particularly contrived algorithm? Is it a particularly contrived set of sensors? No. The answer is they were given time and they were given motivation. And so they learned how to do it. And this is maybe the big lesson that we learned there. So not all you need, but the most interesting thing you need is an interaction protocol and organizing the flow of information. So what kind of data you gather, the better the quality of the data you have, the easier the task. Now, just to carry on with the abstract notions, there's a specific branch of developmental psychology called radical constructivism. And one day I bumped into the writings of this guy here, now is died a few decades ago, unfortunately, Ernst von Glasersfeld. And he was writing about his experience in teaching kids how to do maths. But if you read his words, it's like he's speaking from the perspective of a support vector machine, right? So this is machine learning ante litteram, right? you find regularities in the experiential sequence, and future experience will conform to these regularities. And then you have to find a way to organize the experience. And that's a separating surface that the classifier puts in place, right? That's it. So we published a few papers more in Frontiers and together with another psychologist, and we claim that this could serve as an inspiration. And now the latest experiment we have at our disposal, and I'm just taking 1 minute more, is something that is unpublished material, but there's no details here because there's no big details. Again, the trick is to have people learn how to do the task and to have our machines learn to adapt to their signals. We had a number of different actions here: pronation, supination, extension, flexion, hand closing, hand opening, resting. So in total, it's 9 actions. And we compared 2 control schemas on basically both able-bodied subjects and people with limb difference. That's the politically correct term nowadays, because they are either amputated or they lack a limb since birth. There's a congenital deficiency. And so we used a few sensors, so 2 myobands in the case of intact people, and 6 EMG sensors in a socket for the disabled ones. I mean, 6 CMG sockets. So this is all the technology. And we were able to obtain much better success rates than what we had with the tactile sensor. And in this case, it was a TAC task. So it's much more difficult than what I was doing at that time. And the next step would be to bring this, mount this in a prosthesis, in a controller that's what we're already doing, of course. And as you can see, the success rate in the end is almost 100% for people with hands, and well, close to 80, which is still remarkable. Remember, we have 9 actions altogether proportionally and simultaneously, so we're doing combined actions as well. This is the whole realm of motions of a wrist and hand, not without this degree of freedom. So ulnar radial deviation is not yet there. And as you can see, this is exactly what I wanted to see, and I'm convinced that you like it as well. So this is a typical learning curve. So people are learning how to use the system, and that's the trick. I think I have a couple of movies which will show exactly what I mean. So there's a grade target hand which moves literally in 9 different actions, and you have combined actions to different extents, and I have both intact subjects and amputated subjects, and this as so far it's the result I'm most interested in. This is a cooperation with the Italian INAIL Institute and the Italian Institute of Technology. They provide that hand nowadays, and it has 2 active degrees of freedom at the wrist. So as far as the wrist and hand is concerned, this is probably one of the best prostheses in the world. And so we'll have a couple mutterings for conclusion, but so my idea is that exploiting data quality and interaction, we should build an ever better intent detection, and then maybe agency and embodiment will follow suit. One must not forget that embodiment can be dangerous. So one of my dearest friends in the community is a very critical person, Wolf. He once told me, well, if my prosthesis breaks down, then I don't want to embody it because it would be very painful. It's like breaking a bone. So I'm not sure I want to embody my prosthesis. Yeah, not sure. We always have to ask them to understand what their needs, desires, and intentions are. Right? Good. I think I'm done, and I should be on time. So thank you all very much.
Thank you very much, Claudio. Super interesting talk, and also thank you very much, Helen and Max as well. And right now we're going to the direction of the questions, and we have one question. I think this is the question for Claudio. And the question is about your experiment that you featured in the video, where you showed the video also with the person born without the right arm. And the question was whether there are specific tasks or type of task that did not work well in this experiment with the man without the right hand, or are there almost all of them that are trainable?
I think that also my colleagues are exactly in the same. I think they will align with what I say. My experience is that, so physiologically speaking, people born without limbs, they have no idea what the limbs could do or should do. So if you get an amputated person, you can ask them, imagine you're flexing the wrist or imagine you're closing the hand. And they will produce very distinct patterns, albeit maybe after a few trials. If you get someone who has never had a hand, usually they look at you in bewilderment and they say, well, I have no idea what you're asking me to do because I've never had a hand there. Still, they can produce different activation patterns with the residual muscles. Well, it's not residual, they were born with that. So with the muscles in their limb, whatever it is. And so you can associate those patterns with different actions. And they can become, by that point, they can become as proficient as the others, both the amputated persons and the non-disabled persons. So in the end, from our point of view, I believe the approach is uniform. So we don't need a different approach for, say, people with congenital deficiencies or people with amputations. Answering precisely the question of this person, Thomas, no, we didn't see any specifically hard action to be performed with respect to the others. Not, discerning between congenital deficient persons and amputated persons.
If I can say, we have found, in our experience, we have found that they experience no problems. So basically what we ask them to do is try to do it with their both hands, and in a matter of sessions, they're able to do that. But it's very much dependent on how developed the limb is. So the more distal muscles you have, they will be equivalent to an able body. So it really depends on the patient.
We have a follow-up question from Thomas, actually. Does the embodiment problem lead to phantom limb pain? This is almost the reverse. This is probably from Max, but this is almost the reverse of the traditional phantom limb pain, isn't it?
Yeah. So I wouldn't even call. I will not even say there is an embodiment problem. And so in this, I think I align a bit with Claudio, and maybe Claudio and I differ from a lot of the people in the field. I don't think embodiment. So embodiment is often sold as something that is needed for prosthetic acceptance. There is no evidence for that. We never had patients coming to the clinic and saying like, oh, I'm not going to use this limb because I don't embody it. That's something that just would never hear. And it definitely seems to be something that develops out of good agency and ownership. And then there's this question, what is embodiment? And I feel the more practical definition for embodiment is the separation between agency and ownership, because then at least we have some ways to measure in it. So to answer the question, so if a patient has embodiment of the prosthesis, that means that they have a decent degree of control and sensory feedback, so both agency and ownership. And patients who tend to have a good mobility of their prosthesis, good mobility of their phantom limb, tend to have less phantom limb pain. But embodiment, to me, is even a second or third order phenomenon. So you have good control, then you get agency, and then you can get that embodiment as a second or third degree consequence of the first aim, which will be to provide reliable control. So this is a bit of there's going to be a workshop, actually. We have a couple of workshops on this in MEC and
ICORR.
ICORR, I did that, of course.
Thank you, Helen.
We're all going to be there, of course.
Yeah. So this is an ongoing discussion, and yeah, it's an interesting one.
Yeah, I wanted to shamelessly promote one of the review paper, Max, me, and Johnson, Singer, and also Levi working together. So it's going to be out really soon. I'll keep you posted. We discussed a little bit about this embodiment issue. And also, I think the workshop would further enhance our, understanding from each other, because, there are a lot of discussion on even just a definition difference, like body representation was also considered beyond just the agency and ownership. So just some thoughts.
That's great. We've got a comment and a question from Srinivas Patwardhan, but I think Max has pretty much answered it. More all of you have pretty much answered it. So I'll just read it out. That on that last point from Claudio, I once had a person with amputation say that they don't really want their prosthetic hand to be embodied. They imagine it like a gaming device attached to their body. Should our focus be on tailoring the objective function to the user rather than picking the objective ourselves, such as choosing intuitiveness? I think you pretty much have agreed to that point, isn't it, Max?
Yeah, but it's also, embodiment is not a word that patients will normally know or use. They'll hear it from researchers that maybe use it, unless they're educated on the field or they follow up the work. But normally it's not a word on their vocabulary. I will say that I started my talk saying that there are prostheses and there's control, there's sensor feedback, there's attachment, and depending on the level of amputation, those aspects will be more important for some than for others. So if you have a distal transradial amputation, sockets tend to be, okay as attachment, and then you can have more or less a decent control with pattern recognition and surface electrodes. That then maybe at that point sensory feedback could be something that could increase the function. When it comes to, I will say, in my experience with the patients we have implanted, their major satisfaction or what they value the most is the comfort of a skeletal attachment, so not having that uncomfortable socket in, and then the reliability of control. And then when we move at sensory feedback, some of them have been like, well, it's nice, and you'll see them talking to you and touching the thumb just because it's nice and it's interesting. Functionally, they tend not to see a huge difference. So, and then some people could argue, well, it's because sensory feedback hasn't been implemented in a way that is, considerably better. And sure, that can be, and then you can go into questions of, well, what we're going to need to do that. Do we need to have a neural interface that have 100, channels to be able to differentially activate all the different fiber types so that the sensory feedback is useful, and then how much is going to cost us to do, and how much is going to cost the patients to have. And since my work is very translational, I always have in mind those kind of questions on how much is this going to cost patients, who's going to pay it, and are patients going to have access to it, and so on.
Let me add to that. If you have say standard transradial monolateral amputation, probably a body powered prosthesis is the best solution for you. Yet, as far as reliability is concerned, there's someone I met, again, this colleague is a doctor as well, Wolf, once said, whenever someone comes to me and says, oh, I have a pattern recognition system which is super reliable, I ask them to have me hold their cup of coffee above my laptop, above their laptop. And they usually don't allow me to do that because, reliability is, you have to have a stable grasp all the time. And remember that Cybathlon was won, so the first time, big time, and the second time as well, sort of, by someone, Bob Radosi, say, and Antonio Bicchi's teams, wearing body power prostheses or with minimal EMG control. So, yeah, I side with Mass. First of all, price to performance ratio. Second, comfort. And third, reliability, and not necessarily in this order. I would put them together in a circle. So,
I will let my patients hold the cup of coffee over my laptop, though. So because the reliability of implanted electrodes is rather good.
That's good. Sorry, Katja.
Maybe I have a small question for Max, and probably we need to end afterwards. So I'm just wondering, it's maybe a little bit naive question, but what is the rejection rate for the implanted prosthetic devices compared to the normal ones?
Rejection as in the patient doesn't use it, or complications?
Doesn't want to use it. Not a medical term, but just doesn't really accept it as their own hand or as a device.
We don't have zero, but also we haven't implanted hundreds of patients, right? So we have obviously a handful of patients. Well, at 6, 7 above the elbow and 2 below the elbow. We have had clinical complications of infections and mechanical complications with the connector, so we need to change the connectors because after years of use connection, you have to change those. We have to remove the electrodes in one patient, and recently, unfortunately, another patient. But all these 2 patients, they're asking to have the electrodes placed back. And so if you talk about osseointegration, then you can have some rejection rates. It's also minimal. I don't have the numbers off the top of my head. In the patients that I know with this, and there are different systems. So I know more the statistics of the Swedish system. It's called OPRA. From the patients I know that have, for whatever reason, lose their implant, they all want it back. So it's not a perfect technology. The skin interface can be problematic. They're expected to have superficial skin infection every other year. That was out of a 55 implant study for follow-up with 2 years, and that's more or less about the same for all implant systems. So it's a technology that still can be improved. When it comes to the cost benefit, patients, they still seem to believe that even though there are these complications, they still get a lot more function out of it.
Thank you, Max. I think we don't have any more questions in the chat. There are some compliments to the speakers, though. So thank you very much, Claudio, Helen, and Max. And thank you for the discussion. I think we're out of time, and hopefully this will be interesting for people who also watch afterwards, and it will boost some further discussions and ideas. Thank you, guys.
Thank you for organizing it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Danny, as well.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for your time. And I think Helen needs to start her day already, so better let her go.
We should finish our then.
Apologies, we ran a little over time. Thank you again. That was a fantastic.
Thank you.
Very inspiring presentation. Yeah. Bye-bye.